Good evening, fellow Americans. I decided on this 2025 President's Day to go through the presidents to showcase their pros and cons, basically, for of the time that they were in office. Of course, it's very hard to see what they were like in office just because we were not there. But from what we know, from the many perspectives of these presidents, that there were some positives and negatives, as in the case with any presidential administration. So I just wanted to go through and kind of take a look, 2025 look at the past, and to see pretty much how these presidents. I don't want to rank them. I'm not going to rank them because that would be me looking at the modern eyes and seeing and judging them for a lot of the things that we know now. And I want to just kind of look and see what people have said about the pros and cons of these presidents going through. And then you can make the case if you decide to look further into these presidents. So I want to start with obviously Washington, our first president. I think one of the reasons why people like him is because of the fact that he was our first. That's probably the only reason why people like him. But I think he ranks amongst the presidents in every historical or historian's rankings of the presidents because of the fact that he sets a lot of precedents. And he did warn the United States. He said, hey, we shouldn't have political factions and we shouldn't have entanglements overseas. And we definitely didn't follow that in just the within the 20 years after his death on there. But he set the term of the he set the precedent of the two-term presidency, which was, I think, a big impact just because it really told people that I'm not going to maintain this power. I'm not going to keep this power. And so, therefore, he left and went back to his farm, only to die a couple years later after presidency. But I think that was a pretty good feat on there. I think one of the negatives of his presidency is that he followed too much of Hamilton's policies. While they did strengthen the nation, they also created political factions and kind of started us down a that road of political parties on there. With his successor, John Adams, he didn't really help it out too much. He was a one-term president, and unfortunate because I think he was a great statesman. I think he did a lot for the country early on, but I think he just couldn't get past that idea of formalism and his idea of everything should be cut and dry. And I think because of his immense education. People didn't like him because he came across as pretentious, and so therefore I don't think he was ever going to be liked. But for the most part, he did strengthen the Navy, and he was, even though he was unpopular, he was still able to appoint a person that I think really kind of set the stage for the Supreme Court, which was John Marshall. And he did keep us out of a war with France in the quasi war, although it was a little bit flubbed up, and he did have some questionable policies that he put in because of that. However, I think he kind of because I think there's a reason why he was a one-term president, and that's where I'll leave it at that. Our boy Thomas Jefferson. Now, I think he can be important because of one of the uh, because we have a two, the two terms that people can precedent. Sorry, I can't think of the words. Because we have the two terms precedent, um, I think he embodied the idea of the first term being very um, beginner's luck, and then the second term being the I can't believe I'm here in the second term, because he obviously doubled the nation with the Louisiana Purchase. He was able to reduce national debt, not necessarily him, his Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, but for the most part, we doubled in size. And the negative aspect of it, of his presidency, which was that second term, was the Embargo Act, and that was because Britain and France still fighting over there, and he decided to say we should stop trade with everybody because America can make our own things. He found out real quick that they could not make their own things. Well, they could, but a lot of his people, the farmer people in Virginia, they did not like this because it hurt them. Devastatingly. So, this really much stained not only the United States, but it also stained him because on his gravestone, he doesn't even have that he was president of the United States, a feat that most people would love to put on their tombstone, but he did not want that. He left a legacy, though, because he started the Virginia dynasty, because all of these next presidents are from Virginia, just like him, as well as Washington being from Virginia as well. So, James Madison comes in, our shortest president, and he's going to lead us through the War of 1812. Of course, everybody knows his wife and the famous taking of the George Washington um, portrait and saving stuff out of the White House, but he did strengthen our military through that war on there. I think some of the negative aspects that people tend to look at is the Treaty of Ghent being unresolved after the end of the War of 1812. And with him, though, spurred on a sense of nationalism because this was the last time the Federalists would be in the in the political sphere, or as my term I like to call politisphere. And so I think he had some positives getting us through the war, but some negatives were that it kind of created this Virginia dynasty or began that Virginia dynasty, I guess. He also, I guess you could say, started the trend of Secretary of States becoming president because his Secretary of State will be James Monroe and he will come in and become president. Now, he has a misnomer given to his title, the Era of Good Feelings, even though it wasn't necessarily that much that good of feelings. He did, with the help of his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, issue in the Monroe Doctrine, which didn't do anything of the time, but it did make a strong statement to Congress, and eventually it was eventually used about a century later on there. And so that kind of showcased that America was here. They're ready to roar in the national stage, and don't mess with them. Unfortunately, in his era of good feelings, there was the first big panic of the United States, the Panic of 1819, and he didn't really do a lot to address any of the Native American displacement over there. And again, that might seem more of like a modern kind of take on stuff, but in reality, you're faced with those people as you're moving west, and there's nothing that they're doing to really stop or help any of that native displacement on there. And so, another cool kind of fact about him is that he was almost elected unanimously, but I think it was Vermont, somebody from Vermont decided to vote against him because they said that George Washington should be the only one that's elected unanimously. So poor James Monroe did not get elected unanimously. His successor, John Quincy Adams, the first president to be photographed using daguerreotype, and he is just like his father, great statesman, but once they became president, not so hot. I think because for the most part, I mean, he tried to strengthen some federal programs and get infrastructure going. He did promote anti-slavery policies, so I guess you could say he was very progressive for his time. Unfortunately, because of how he got into office, he was stained. He had the corrupt bargain, which was briefly that there was four different people running for office. One guy got too sick. William Crawford got sick, and he bowed out. But then you had Jackson, Henry Clay, and John Quincy Adams. Well, long story short, Henry Clay threw his people and his support behind John Quincy Adams, which was considered a corrupt bargain because John Quincy Adams was going to dub Henry Clay Secretary of State, who we all know at this time could become president later on. So that was probably the thing that stained his presidency for that term, and he was not elected again. Andrew Jackson, though, getting the hype, and one of the most important parts out of his presidency was the fact that a lot of people turned out to vote. So there was this idea of mass democracy during his presidency, and he did get rid of the national debt, and he was very much into creating a strong defense for America. His One of many cons out of his presidency is the issuing in or the initiation of the Indian Removal Act. Even though the courts sided with the Cherokee natives, he said they can't enforce anything. It is eventually his successor that issues in the Trail of Tears, but he is the one that's behind it all. He did create a lot of executive power for himself, so people called him King Andrew, and so that's probably not good. And there was a panic because of the fact that he got rid of the national debt, which was kind of nice. The bad part about that is because we didn't have any debt, it was left to the states to kind of decide their banking systems, and they all collapsed and eventually went into the Panic of 1837, which they thought that his successor, Martin Van Buren, would help out, but he did not. He was known as the little magician, but he did not do any kind of magical things. As for as some people don't really know that he was president, but he did establish an independent treasury system to kind of offset the panic, but it didn't really help that much. And he did strengthen our ties with Britain, which was cool. But he is pretty much blamed for the panic. It's kind of, I guess, good for Jackson because he left office saying like, "Ooh, sorry, you guys got to panic," and Martin Van Buren took that on, and tensions between South Carolina and the North pretty much started to really kind of um, it started to heat up, and partly of that partly of that was also because of Jackson, because Jackson he was going to recognize Texas, but he already knew that slavery was a huge issue of the time, so he wasn't even going to touch that. So that was relinquished to Martin Van Buren, who didn't really want to resolve it either. And then we go to Harrison. Poor guy, he only had a month. And not even that. And I think so because we can't really talk about his presidency. We could talk about how he was a general. He fought in the War of 1812. He brought a curse upon the American presidents, Tecumseh's curse, because he himself is elected in 1840, and it'll span every 20 years a president that was in office, that was elected in a 0 year, died. And so I'll go through those as we go through them. So he died 32 days into office. That's obviously a big con because he doesn't really have any kind of achievements. He was a big proponent of a new political party called the Whig Party. But other than that, sorry, he's gone. John Tyler comes in to fill in for him, and this guy kind of split politics because he was a Whig, but then they felt like he was a betrayer of the Whigs, and so he clashed with his own party, and a lot of his policies increased the sectional tension, which was no bueno because he annexed Texas and wanted to expand into there. He did have the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which kind of settled border disputes with Britain, but for the most part, didn't do anything to calm the storm that was coming with the sectional tensions on there. And then you've got this guy who I didn't really know much about Polk until college when a couple of my uh, peers said that Polk was their favorite president, and I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because he's the only president so far that has ever promised certain things. He's promised things, and he got them done within that first term. He's only a one-term president, but yet he wanted Oregon, he wanted California, he settled that. He wanted Mexico, or Mexico's territory, I should say, and he got them in the Mexican-American War, and he wanted to strengthen the treasury system, in which he pretty much did. He held something that would hold for the nation until we had the Federal Reserve. Obviously, the cons then would be igniting the Mexican American War and not healing the tensions that were increasing with the expansion in slavery, and then that war with Mexico, him pretty much go adding Mexico to fight in this war and keeping the North and South tensions pretty hot. So he will leave. Feeling successful, basically, as to doing whatever he said he was going to do. You have Zachary Taylor, who was a general in the Mexican American War, which caused him a lot of popularity, and he opposed the expansion of slavery, so that was good. He didn't like that because not only just because he was trying to be moral. I don't even know if he was trying to be moral, but it was mostly because they were tired of the sectional tensions that were heating up. He died early, though. He ate too many cherries. That's actually a shirt that I have that it said cherries. I love cherries. And he died of some gastrointestinal thing, but it was known that the last food that he ate was cherries on there. So he didn't really have good political experience, so that could be a no on there. Millard Fillmore comes in to fill. It comes into Phil for Taylor. Anyway, he signs the Compromise of 1815, which at the time was seen as a success for a lot of Northerners, but I think a lot of people still in the back of their head was like, no, this isn't a success. And it was really a band aid over the issues of slavery and because you had the Missouri Compromise, which Monroe had had to deal with in 1820, and now Fillmore is dealing with this, and it eased sectional tensions, but I think some people would say it actually ignited another flame of sectional tensions within there. He did strengthen trade with, started to go international now that we're all the way west because California becomes a state underneath the Compromise of 1850, and so he strengthens our ties with Japan. I think under him is when Matthew Perry. Obviously not the Friend star. Commodore Matthew Perry. I think it's under him that he goes in there, but I could be wrong. And then some of his negatives is the Fugitive Slave Act that came apart with the Compromise of 1850. Really kind of angered the North, and again kind of flurried up those sectional tensions, which his successor Franklin Pierce would not really heal or try to heal in any way. He did try. He strengthened his own party, the Democratic Party, and tried to expand trade and diplomacy with the Gadsden Purchase that finishes off that little sliver in New Mexico and Arizona. And so he did that um, because I can see why he wasn't really efficient. Um, his wife and him and his small child were in a train accident, and he literally saw the train car go on top of his son and kill him. And so that was right before his presidency. And so clearly he wasn't going to be that efficient, or I don't even know why he still took the job, but either way, he was there, and he does something that I think was the unthinkable in signing the Kansas Nebraska Act. And that is what I always tell my students was kind of the start of the Civil War. Of course, you can make the case for anything, but um, the Kansas Nebraska Act led to a lot of people going into Kansas, and that's why they called it Bleeding Kansas, because a lot of people died as a lot of pro slavery people were going in there against anti slavery. And so he didn't really, he pretty much worsened the sectional divide, which is why he is not really well, that's why not people don't really talk about him unless we're talking about this. And then there's this guy who is really does nothing to help any of the crises that are going on. One of the biggest ones that the Dred Scott case has a chance right there to kind of heal a little bit of the tensions that are going on, and he doesn't do anything about anything. He attempted to try to or he didn't even try to attempt to maintain peace between the North and the South. And so, because of his weak leadership, maybe it's because he didn't have a wife. He was our bachelor president, but for the most part, yeah, he led us into the Civil War. And then you've got Abraham Lincoln, who comes in, and he is um, at the beginning of the war, he's all about just keeping the union. His main idea is to keep the union, and then towards the middle of the war, he's like, "Hey, we also need to make sure that there are free, there's freedom for everybody." And so he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which doesn't do anything at the time, but it's the symbolism of now we're fighting a war for to end slavery as well. He did strengthen the federal government, as they did a lot of things in the Civil War, like to make sure that for the future the government was going to be a big part in how people settled in the West. He during the war, though, he did do some things that I didn't know until recently, that it was a part of the Constitution that apparently you can suspend the writ of habeas corpus, which was limiting civil liberties, but you can do that in times of war, and he definitely did that. And which is basically trying people without having to have them hear anybody. You just pretty much arrest them and get them in there. And so um, before, I mean, he had an idea of how to solve, or how to, he had a solution, or at least one solution for after the Civil War, but uh, he wasn't able to conclude that because he was killed, and he becomes our first president that is assassinated. Not the first president to die in office, but he was the first president to be assassinated. And people do wonder. What would it have been like in Reconstruction if he were to be alive? Because we had to deal with this guy instead, Andrew Johnson, who was very much wanting to just get rid of the past in the sense of trying to restore the Union. And he didn't like any kind of retribution against the South. He didn't want anybody to hold on to that revenge. And so he vetoed a lot of key Reconstruction bills that really could have solved the case of. Um, really could have been the guiding solution to white versus black on here, because you had a lot of free slaves that were starting to get jobs, starting to get into Congress, and you had all these people that were actually starting to cooperate with each other. And because he just wanted to end, uh, not even deal with all of these issues that were coming up in the South about blacks taking their you know, taking their the South's government and this and that and the fears over there, because he didn't really he didn't really solve that. It was kind of left to the states, and if the states were going to handle it, the South was going to handle it the way that they knew how, which was to try to pass black codes and limit any of the freedmen's rights on there. And because he had a clash with a lot of the radical Republicans of the time, he does get impeached. He's the first president to get impeached, but he's not fully impeached, um, but barely. But he's not fully impeached on there. So he's kind of left with what would have happened if Lincoln was there instead of him? Could he have solved that case? Because from here on out, people are still worried about the newly freed slaves, and they are worried about their well-being. But as time goes on and as nothing is really getting handled in the South, people start to wane on their support for helping Black Americans in there. Ulysses S. Grant was one that did want to try to protect civil rights for a lot of African Americans during the Reconstruction. He cracked down on the KKK that was coming out on there. He supported a lot of economic growth to further industrial expansion and to get Black Americans working. And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were coming about throughout this whole time, and he was a very much supporter of all of that. And he was big on having the military kind of keep the peace in the South. Unfortunately, though, his administration was marred by a lot of scandals, like the credit mobilier scandal, the whiskey ring scandal, where his administration was a part of it. And people always have to ask, okay, well, did he know about it? Because if he knew about it, that's bad. Did he not know about it? That's still bad because it shows you're incompetent of your own administration. So he was marred by a lot of scandal going on during that time. And it didn't help that a panic of 1873 hit. And so eventually he probably could have gone for a third term, but he effectively did not. And so there was two other guys, this guy and Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden will win the popular vote, but he will lose the election to this guy. Some say because of another corrupt bargain where he becomes president and he officially ends Reconstruction by taking all the military that Grant had put into the South and removing them. And because they removed them, it effectively left the South to deal with all of their own issues, and that was harmful for African Americans that were in the South. And so, because he withdrew them, it initiated the Jim Crow laws, and because of his corrupt bargain of his own, he was never really able to outlast that. And this poor guy, James Garfield. Now, I read a lot about this guy, and I think he could have been the next Abraham Lincoln. I think he could have been well, he could have, should have, would have. He could have been a lot of things, but his life was cut short. He's shot in July of 1881, and he dies in September. So he holds on for a lot. There's a whole thing I could talk about with him, but one of the things that set him apart from a lot of the politicians of the time was that he wanted to protect African Americans. He wanted to promote education and he wanted to promote racial equality, which he did. And then he also wanted to stop the corruption, stop the spoil system in there. So he said, we wanted civil service reform. People should get their job based off of merit, not just of what they can do for each other. Unfortunately, he was assassinated by Charles Guiteau, and so we'll never know what would have happened. But what did happen was he was able to change this guy a little bit because this guy passes the Civil Service Reform Act that Garfield had initiated, and this guy was a political puppet for another guy named Roscoe Conkling. We don't need to know about him, but it changed his mind after he saw the immense outpouring of support for Garfield in his time of need. And so Arthur said, I want to go down in history as somebody. He still doesn't go down as somebody, but he does issue the civil service reform and he strengthens our Navy. He's not really known for anything else on there. This guy is our president that is the first president to get elected in non-consecutive terms and still issues that whole first term, second term thing. The first term, he fought corruption. He instituted a lot of civil service reforms. He vetoed a lot of wasteful spending bills that the government was doing at the time. And he wanted to maintain our gold standard because at the time, people were fighting about silver and gold and which one, if they could use both of them. It was mostly the farmers that were pushing silver to be used to be able to catch up with gold on there. And he supported the gold standard because he saw that had really helped the nation thrive during the Gilded Age. Some of the cons, though, is that he didn't really care to work with the farmers' struggles, and he didn't really address any kind of the injustices that were happening in the South, especially with the Jim Crow laws. And so that was pretty much his first term, but it gave way to Benjamin Harrison, who was the grandson of our boy eh, William Henry Harrison, who died in 1840. And Benjamin Harrison comes in, and his Congress is known as the $1 billion Congress. Um, I think you can guess why, because they spent a lot of money, because he was left with a big surplus of money, and so they spend, spend, spend. One of the cool things about him is that he started to try to trust bust. He started to go against some of these monopolies that were going on, like the Sherman Antitrust Act. However, there were loopholes in there. Again, not his problem, but he did try to at least symbolically and policy wise stop the monopolies on there. He did increase tariffs though, which hurt a lot of the consumers at the time and kind of helped, along with other factors, helped along with getting into that panic of 1893, which is when our boy shows up again with. Grover Cleveland coming back in, and this is where he's not going to have a great time because he's going to have to deal with the panic of 1893. And so that pretty much mars his presidency for the second term on there. Again, I'm just going to pause real quick to make sure to mention that obviously there's a lot of other things that these presidents might have done, maybe not just Sir Arthur, but there's a lot of other things that they've done. So I'm just trying to go through quickly just so you can get a glimpse. And if you feel interested about any of them, then definitely go in and um, try to look it up. But we will continue on with our William McKinley here. And William McKinley is, well, he's got some cool eyebrows on there. He leads us in the Spanish American War. And he oversaw a big, strong economic growth during his time, mostly because he was backed by big money. Big business was really supportive of William McKinley. His expansionism, though, I'll never forget. I read a book that's called Murdering McKinley, and it said that not Murdering McKinley, that one too, but there was another one that was on Why We Fight. I think it's called Why We Fight. And it was really good because there was a quote in there where he basically says, "We want to go help our little brown brothers over there in the Philippines." Not so great, because when we go in the Spanish American War, we do what we need to. That's called the Splendid Little War because we do what we need to and move on, except we move on to other territories like the other Spanish colonies, like the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico. And in the Philippines, we ignite a war between the Philippines and us and Emilio Aguinaldo, the guy that's over there fighting as a freedom fighter for the Philippines, he goes in and says, I'm going to remind you, Mr. McKinley, of your boy Abraham Lincoln in saying that no country can take over another without their consent. And so that leads to a lot of controversy, which kind of mars his presidency. But in his second term, he's not allowed to really do anything about it because he is going to get assassinated by Leon Czolgosz, who is the third president to be assassinated on there. And that paves the way for Theodore Roosevelt, who comes in and he was put on the vice presidency ticket, much to the chagrin of a lot of big businesses because they knew that he was very vocal in not a great way too, because they didn't like his voice. And so he comes in trying to break up a lot of these large monopolies. He really wants to regulate them, not necessarily take them out completely, but just regulate them. He expands the national parks and conservation efforts, and he strengthens our global influence, of course, by going through with his great white fleet, not a racial thing, but I guess you can symbolically say that, but a great white fleet where he tours around the world to basically show everybody else that, hey, we've got a big stick, don't mess with us. That is his diplomacy, which is a good thing if you want to look powerful, a bad thing if you want to look powerful, I guess. And one of the things that I always tell my students, even though I have a bunch of pictures of Teddy, is he was very imperialistic, which is not a cool thing. And then he was also, one of the things I don't think I could ever forgive him is the Buffalo Soldiers that fought alongside him in the Spanish American War. He never paid them their due when he came back, even though he has, like many other people, he's a contradiction. He went and spoke for the NAACP rally one time and was like, "Hey, we're with you," kind of thing. He still never paid the Buffalo Soldiers, and I felt like that was always a miss for civil rights in the early 1900s. And then his handpicked successor, who kind of looks like him, except probably weighs another 150 pounds, is William Taft. And this guy continues the trust busting, probably busts more trust than Teddy, and he expands civil service reform. So yay for him. Except for the problem is he's a one-term president because he didn't really have that charisma. He didn't have that appeal that presidents had. And the other thing he issued in instead of a big stick diplomacy, he does this dollar diplomacy, which is basically where he's going to go and install banks and people on the boards of other places in Latin America, kind of causing some rifts over there. And so he's, although he's known as a progressive president, he's just not as wooing as, say, this Salem's Lot figure and Teddy Roosevelt. And so Woodrow Wilson comes in as a Democrat ticket, but he is a progressive. And so is the new third party that's coming up during this time, which is the Bull Moose Party of Teddy Roosevelt. He will get elected because of Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party, splitting the Republican ticket and allowing Woodrow Wilson to become president. Now, he passed a lot of progressive reforms because a lot of these people want to, you know, get some money for the people. They want to install something that is stable, like the Federal Reserve. And so he does all of these reforms. I think his big thing was tariffs, taxes, and banks is what he was going after on there, and he leads us through World War One for our year and a half that we're in there or less. And he supports a League of Nations to have some kind of international um, gathering to help each other. And the problem with that is, though, he didn't really tell the rest of the United States because they don't approve it, and we're never in the League of Nations on there. He did segregate the federal government. He was, I wouldn't even say a closet racist anymore, but he did watch The Birth of a Nation, which is by D.W. Griffith. It's very like trying to get the KKK, like feeling like they're somebody. And he's quoted. Now I haven't found it again, so maybe he's not quoted, so I'm not going to have rumors, but supposedly he likes it. He likes that movie, and so I feel like he's a little racist on there as he's segregating the federal government. During World War One, he did some questionable things like putting in the Espionage and Sedition Acts to kind of stop any kind of foreign influence on there. And so yeah, so pretty much yeah, we can kind of towards the end of his life and towards the end of his presidency, he's going over there with the Treaty of Versailles to try to solve the World War One issues, but he's not very wooing over there, and so he's eventually going to give way to the successor, Warren G. Harding. And Warren G. Harding is going to reverse or try to reverse everything that was happening in the progressive era. He saw that things in the Gilded Age from the 1860s to 1900s were great. He said, hey, business was doing good. Let them do what they need to do. Let the government stay out. And so he promoted economic recovery with a phrase called return to normalcy. And that was basically return to the days of before the progressive era where we didn't worry about social issues and we were more about political and economic issues. And so he tried to reduce arms across internationally, which kind of pissed some people off. But for the most part, I mean, it got him a good name. His administration was marred by scandals as well, though. One of the bigger scandals being the Teapot Dome scandal, and he's eventually going to die in office as he's trying to go on this tour for his next, election. But it comes out after he dies about this corruption, so he's never able to face the music while he's alive. And this pretty boy guy is Calvin Coolidge, who they call Silent Cal. He oversaw this huge economic boom in the 20s. He reduced a lot of government intervention in business. However, he also didn't do much to kind of help the farmers or help any kind of these labor issues that were going on. Some people say he ignored signs of the Great Depression, and that's pretty much what they look at him. There's some good books on Calvin Coolidge. Amity Shlaes does one that really kind of I saw a different side of Calvin Coolidge, but for the most part, yes, he had a great boom during his presidency. However, there was some social and social issues that were never cleared up with his presidency. And then you've got Herbert Hoover that comes in and he promotes what he was promoting in World War One, which was volunteerism. That's how we won World War One. That's how we're gonna, make our country better. And he wanted to be economically efficient. He expanded a lot of projects, i.e., the Hoover Dam. I don't think I'm using IE right. I think I'm trying to say like anyway. So we've got he failed though to really respond to the Great Depression, and when he did respond, it was something that was only helping people of money, and so a lot of the commoners and everybody else that didn't have money saw that as being, of course, bad. And so he didn't want direct government control into helping Americans, which allowed Americans to slip further and further into a depression in which this guy will try to fend off. And hell, he'll have 4 terms to try to do it because he is our only president to go past the 2 terms because there was no laws written against it. And he leads us through the Great Depression and into World War II. And World War II being that defining moment that really gets us out of the Great Depression. Although he tried with all of his New Deal programs and his alphabet soup of programs, and he established a lot of things that we still have today, a lot of things that some people like, some people don't, and he expanded the federal government's role pretty much in the economy. And part of that is a negative too, because now the government is involved in every aspect of there. During the war, he interned a lot of the Japanese Americans who were hardcore American. It was pretty rare to find a traitor Japanese person. And so he issued Executive Order 9066 in time of war. And so some people obviously don't like that, including many Japanese Americans to this day. And some of those New Deal programs were a bit costly and a lot costly, and were controversial. One of the biggest controversies there is during his time was when he tried to pack the Supreme Court, and people didn't like that because that is trying to gain too much power. Not that he didn't already have it, because he was into his 4th term when eventually he will die. And when he dies in his 4th term, his vice president, Harry Truman, will take over. He's going to end World War II with the big 2 atomic bombs, and that's going to live with him and haunt him both simultaneously for the rest of his life. He does establish NATO and kind of starts us off into the Cold War against the Soviet Union. He is the president to finally desegregate the military. Um, in the Korean conflict, he was very unpopular because it was so inconclusive. Although there's a great documentary that really made me change my mind on Korean War, which says that we were successful in the sense that we contained communism, but I could see where people would not like him because it felt like they went away from the 38th parallel and came back to the 38th parallel. The use of nuclear weapons, of course, in his time are controversial. Some of the things like the Truman Doctrine, where they went and held Greece and Turkey in the Cold War to prevent communism from spreading, that was seen also as a positive. And his successor, Dwight Eisenhower, will come in and oversees this huge economic prosperity in the 50s. I mean, the 50s are the consumer republic, and it is, he does the interstate highway system. NASA comes around, hell, Disneyland comes around, right? Strengthen U.S. global leadership um, with his AWACS. Oh my goodness, I'm thinking I'm losing his strategy. His strategy. What's his strategy? Oh, I'm going off the whim, people. Um, okay, well, maybe it'll come back to me. But he had a strategy during the Cold War that was different than Truman. It was the new. Oh, wasn't the new look. Okay, anyway, time is going away from me. But he tried to strengthen our position in the Cold War, and then he hesitated on a little bit of civil rights going on. Yes, he did deal with some of the civil rights issues that were going on, but he did not head them on, and that is a bad thing for the society as a whole because even though they are booming consumer wise, socially, they're left in limbo. And he did expand Cold War interventions into Latin America. The Eisenhower Doctrine, though, is usually kind of focused in the Middle East, where he's trying to involve us over there in the Middle East. And so that's always no bueno, but because we see what that has entailed to today. John F. Kennedy comes in afterwards, and this guy, I don't know why to this day still, but apparently the women of the time loved him. And mostly because he was young, but he was also our first Catholic president on there, and he launches that space race and promotes civil rights. People in Latin America love him. He handles the Cuban Missile Crisis successfully after those 13 pivotal days. One of the things that he comes in, though, he immediately has to deal with the Bay of Pigs invasion and how much press that is getting. And he took that on, even though Eisenhower started it. He kind of took that on, as well as he also took on Vietnam in the sense that they added more troops over there to Vietnam when Eisenhower had started putting troops over there, or bodies over there, basically. And he was assassinated when he was trying to fulfill a lot of goals. One of those goals being that cooperation with the Soviet Union to try to end the Cold War. But he is our third president that is. Um, Sorry, our fourth president that is assassinated on there. And then, so successor Lyndon Johnson comes in. He passes a bunch of civil rights acts, and he has this great society programs, and he has this vision of America where they don't have homeless people, and he's going to expand Medicare, expand Medicaid, and then he's dealt with the encroaching Vietnam entity that is coming on there that every president before him has already escalated. And so, as it's escalating the Vietnam War, he has to decide, does he want his great society programs or does he want Vietnam? He knows, like Oprah, he can't have both. He can't have a husband and money, right? You can't have both of these things. And so he decides to go with Vietnam, and the Great Society programs kind of fail because, for one, they're expensive, and for another, he's dealing with Vietnam. And this guy will end Vietnam. Well, for the most part, he escalates it first before withdrawing on there, which is a big negative on there. And of course, the Watergate scandal is going to mar his presidency and mar his um, the way people look at him and his history. Even though he did open relations with China, he did reduce Cold War tensions with the time. As a statesman, I feel like he did okay under Eisenhower, but I think once you've got this Watergate scandal going on, it's going to haunt you and mar you for there. You've got Gerald Ford that comes in afterwards, who tries to heal the nation after Watergate, but it's it can't happen. It doesn't happen because he pardons Nixon, and the people, they think that that's a betrayal. And so, of course, he's not really going to be seen as um anything more than that. He did try to manage economic challenges, but it just wasn't for the time and the issues that were going on in the 70s. It wasn't good enough because he struggled with that inflation. And then you've got Jimmy Carter, who promotes a lot of human rights, probably the only president that actually deserved their Nobel Peace Prize. He helps negotiate the Camp David Accords. He is a little bit weak on that, responding to the Iran hostage crisis, which we know later on that they were probably just waiting for Reagan to get in office before they released him. But either way, that didn't look too good with the public, and there was a lot of high inflation and unemployment during his presidency. So, of course, that was also seen as why he probably wasn't elected in that next year. And you had that larger than life figure, Ronald Reagan, who comes in and he does revitalize the economy, at first not being so good, but then eventually it does get better in there. He helps end the Cold War with a lot of his rhetoric and his sternness. He does increase the national debt significantly, though, and the Iran Contra scandal will taint his administration on there when they're giving. There's a lot of shady money and shady dealings having to do with not just Iran, but Nicaragua as well on there. So George H.W. Bush will officially end the Cold War, and but as he ends the Cold War and you end communism, now what do they do? And apparently, they decide to go into the Gulf War, to go after Saddam Hussein and what was happening in Kuwait at the time. He did it. The economy struggled during his presidency, but I don't know how much you can say in that 4 years that he was there because he was only a one-term president on there, and he broke his I think a lot of people felt betrayed when he broke his no new taxes kind of thing, so it lost a lot of voter trust, which led the way for Bill Clinton to come in, and he presides over pretty good economic prosperity, mostly because we are the only superpower now. China is developing, but Russia is in shambles, and he balanced a lot of budgets. A lot of people now today would see that he was a little bit more moderate during the time. He expands NATO and leads to international peacekeeping efforts, which can also be seen as a negative as to what happens in like Black Hawk Down, that kind of stuff, over there in Africa. And then, of course, he was impeached due to the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And some people didn't like the whole NAFTA thing, while some people thought it was great. Others didn't like it. So they basically was controversial. And so, with those two things, it kind of marred his second term presidency. However, his popularity was still surprisingly very high on there. And so, like I said, some people today think back and they're like, oh, there was a lot of actual I think more moderates at that time in the 90s. Maybe that was because of Newt. I don't know, but there was a lot of different uh, uh, things that went on with moderation. Like people were a little bit more susceptible to cross the party lines on there. And so lastly, these are the presidents that come afterwards on there. A very scary picture of Trump, though, that, these are all Wikipedia pictures, and it's just funny how like all of them are all smiling, and then you've got, you're fired kind of look on there. But you've got George Bush Jr. that comes in, and this is the round. I mean, Clinton's around the time when I'm alive too, but George Bush, I'm paying a little bit more attention to because 9/11 happens when I'm in seventh grade, and you've got Bush on there, so he's the only president really that I knew, and and then when he got out of office, then you got Obama, which was historic in that regard, and then you had Trump come in, and then Biden, and then Trump again now. And so the reason why I don't want to talk about those as far as they're good and they're bad is because we're still kind of trying to figure out. I think obviously, if you talk to certain people, they'll be good. If you talk to other people, they'll be bad. But I guess I want to end it all on this President's Day of saying, and thank you for sticking with me for this long too. But I do want to say that the President's Day is something that we take a lot of value in voting for a president. At least a majority of the people do that do go out and vote. They take a big stake in the country when they're electing somebody on there. I think what we do need to remember is that they are symbolic and that they are people just like you and me in the sense of they're human. I wouldn't say they're just like Mr. Bush and Obama are not like me in the sense that like I would never be able to get to that stage. And but I think at the same time they are all human. We do want them to be successful no matter who they are. And one of the things that makes America great is that we can judge them and we can voice our opinions against them. And I like that. I like being able to go in and say, well, I don't really like this of them, but I do like this of them. And so we do know that they're human. We do know that we put a lot of stake in what they bring to the table, but we do remember that our government was set up in three different branches: the executive, the legislative, and judicial. And you've got to be able to get past all of those. And I also want to say that even though these presidents are supposed to be our leaders, we definitely don't want to put um, too much faith in the fact that it's just them leading. It's the government as a whole, and a lot of that is who they appoint, of course. But I think on this President's Day, it really made me kind of think that I want this to be a successful presidency for Trump. I want this to be a successful presidency for anybody that comes after Trump because I like living where I'm living, and I'm hoping that I can live here for a really long time. And so we shall see what goes on. I'm going to root for Trump like I rooted for Biden, like I rooted for Trump before, like I rooted for Obama. I actually voted for Obama on his first term, but that's why I want to make sure that we know as an American people that we vote for these people. We hope that they do the best. If your team wasn't picked this time, then all you can do is hope that you rally enough people that your team can win the next time. And just remember that your team and their team is our team. We're all in this because we all live here. And so hopefully we can remember that. And hopefully you've learned a little bit about each of these presidency. I'm sorry that it took almost an hour, but if you have the time to check it out, you should. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm out.